Ken Paxton has been reinstated as the Attorney General of the state of Texas after being suspended when the Texas House voted to impeach him. Hey there, I'm Brandi, digital anchor at KHOU 11 in Houston. And after a trial that stretched 9 days, the jurors in the impeachment trial, the senators in this case, they voted to acquit Ken Paxton on 16 different articles and to dismiss 4 others that they really didn't even consider. And they went article by article voting on each one, with presiding judge Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick reading the final tally. We're going to go through all 16 of them right here.
Members, you will now vote on Article 1. I will read the article for you each time. Disregard of official duty, protection of charitable organization. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton violated the duties of his office by failing to act as public protector of charitable organizations as required by Chapter 123 of the Property Code. Specifically, Paxton caused employees of his office to intervene in a lawsuit brought by the Roy F. and Joanne Cole Mitty Foundation against several corporate entities controlled by Nate Paul. Paxton harmed the Mitty Foundation in an effort to benefit Paul. A yay total 14 yeas, 16 nays. A finding of acquittal is entered as to Article 1. Members, you will now vote on Article 2. Disregard of official duty, abuse of the opinion process. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official power to issue written legal opinions under Subchapter C, Chapter 402 Government Code. Specifically, Paxton caused employees of his office to prepare an opinion in an attempt to avoid the impending foreclosure sales of properties belonging to Nate Paul or business entities controlled by Paul. Paxton concealed his actions by soliciting the chair of a Senate committee to serve as a straw requester. Furthermore, Paxton directed employees of his office to reverse their legal conclusion for the benefit of Paul. There being 14 yeas, 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 2. Members, you will now be voting on Article 3, disregard of official duty, abuse of the open records process. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official power to administer the Public Information Law, Chapter 552 of the Government Code. Specifically, Paxton directed employees of his office to act contrary to law by refusing to render a proper decision relating to a public information request for records held by the Department of Public Safety, and by issuing a decision involving another public information request that was contrary to law and applicable to legal precedent. There being 14 ayes, 16 nays, the finding of acquittal is entered for Article 3. Members, you are now voting on Article 4, disregard of official duty, misuse of official information. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official power to administer the Public Information Law, Chapter 552 of the Government Code. Specifically, Paxton improperly obtained access to information held by his office that had not been publicly disclosed for the purpose of providing information to the benefit of Nate Paul. 28 nays, 2 yeas. A finding of acquittal is entered for Article 4. Members, you will now vote on Article 5, disregard of official duty, engagement of KHOU. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official powers by violating the laws governing the appointment of prosecuting attorneys pro tem. Specifically, Paxton engaged Brandi Smith, a licensed attorney, to conduct an investigation into a baseless complaint during which Smith issued more than 30 grand jury subpoenas in an effort to benefit Nate Paul or Paul's business entities. 13 yeas, 17 nays. A finding of acquittal is entered for Article 5. Members, you will now be voting on Article 6, disregard of official duty, termination of whistleblowers. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton violated the duties of his office by terminating and taking adverse personal action against employees of his office in violation of this state's whistleblower law, Chapter 554 of the Government Code. Specifically, Paxton terminated employees of his office who made good faith reports in his unlawful actions to law enforcement authorities. Paxton terminated the employees without good cause or due process and in retaliation for reporting his illegal acts and improper conduct. Furthermore, Paxton engaged in a public and private campaign to impugn the employees' professional reputations or prejudice their future employment. There being 14 yeas and 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 6. Members, we now move on for you to vote on Article 7, misapplication of public resources, whistleblower investigation and report. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused public resources entrusted to him. Specifically, Paxton directed employees of his office to conduct a sham investigation into whistleblower complaints made by employees whom Paxton had terminated and to create and publish a lengthy written report containing false and misleading statements in Paxton's defense. 14 ayes, 16 nays. A finding of acquittal is entered as to Article 7. Members, you will now vote on Article 8, disregard of official duty settlement agreement. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official powers by concealing his wrongful acts in connection with whistleblower complaints made by employees whom Paxton had terminated. Specifically, Paxton entered into a settlement agreement with the whistleblowers that provides for payment of the settlement from public funds. The settlement agreement stayed the wrongful termination suit and conspicuously delayed the discovery of facts and testimony at trial to Paxton's advantage, which deprived the electorate of its opportunity to make an informed decision when voting for Attorney General. There being 8 yeas and 22 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 8. Members, you will now vote on Article 9, constitutional bribery, Paul's employment of mistress. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton engaged in bribery in violation of Section 41, Article 16, Texas Constitution. Specifically, Paxton benefited from Nate Paul's employment of a woman with whom Paxton was having an extramarital affair. Paul received favorable legal assistance from or specialized access to the office of the Attorney General. There being 12 yeas and 18 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 9. We have 16 total articles to vote on. We are now on Article number 10. Constitutional bribery, Paul's providing renovations to the Paxton home. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton engaged in bribery in violation of Section 41, Article 16, Texas Constitution. Specifically, Paxton benefited from Nate Paul providing renovations to Paxton's home. Paul received favorable legal assistance from or specialized access to the office of the Attorney General. Being 14 yeas, 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered as to Article 10. We are now to Article 11. I'm sorry, it's Article 15 because we skipped a few numbers. False statements in official records, whistleblower response report. This is Article 15. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton made false or misleading statements in official records to mislead both the public and public officials. Specifically, Paxton made or caused to be made multiple false or misleading statements in a lengthy written report issued by his office in response to whistleblower allegations. There being 14 yeas and 16 nays, the finding of acquittal is entered for Article 15. Members, you will now vote on Article 16, conspiracy and attempted conspiracy. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton acted with others to conspire or attempt to conspire to commit acts described in one or more articles. 14 yeas, 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 16. Members, you are now voting on Article 17, misappropriation of public resources while holding office as Attorney General. Warren Kenneth Paxton misused his official powers by causing employees of his office to perform services for his benefit and the benefit of others. 14 yeas, 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered to Article 17. Members, you will now vote on Article 18, dereliction of duty. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton violated the Texas Constitution, his oaths of office, statutes, and public policy against public officials acting contrary to the public interest by engaging in acts described in one or more articles. There being 14 yeas and 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered as to Article 18. Members, you will now vote on Article 19, unfitness for office. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton engaged in misconduct, private or public, of such character as to indicate his unfitness for office, as shown by the acts described in one or more articles. 14 yeas, 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered for Article 19. Members, this is the last article for you to vote on, Article 20, abuse of public trust. While holding office as Attorney General, Warren Kenneth Paxton used, misused, or failed to use his official powers in a manner calculated to subvert the lawful operation of the government of the state of Texas and to obstruct the fair and impartial administration of justice, thereby bringing the office of Attorney General into scandal and disrepute to the prejudice of public confidence in the government of this state, as shown by the acts described in one or more articles. Show there being 14 yeas and 16 nays, a finding of acquittal is entered as to Article 20. Senator Birdwell, I understand you have a motion. Members, do you still have a blank form on your desk? So you will vote. Yea is to dismiss the remaining articles. Nay is to deny the motion to dismiss. So yea is to dismiss. A nay vote is to deny. Please mark your ballots carefully. There being 19 yeas and 11 nays, the motion is granted.
All right, that was tedious to sit through, and that was the sped up version. That took place over the course of hours. Our KHOU 11 political analyst, Brandi Smith, was here in studio watching this all unfold, and it seemed like you kind of got a sense very early on that this was leaning toward the defense.
Yeah, Brandi, we sat through all of it, and it did take a while, but it was pretty instructive. And I think it was instructive because you did start to see these patterns form. You saw basically two Republicans siding with the House managers that they thought that Ken Paxton was guilty on these articles, but that was it. They needed to have 9, and they only got 2, and so that was pretty stunning. In a way, this was baked into the cake. The rules were very truncated that allowed essentially for it to be a very fast trial. The standard here was pretty high. It was a criminal standard beyond a reasonable doubt. And many of the senators have indicated after the fact that they thought that simply it was the case that the House managers hadn't met that high standard.
Now, I was impressed by how quickly after the votes, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who was acting as the presiding judge, was able to write up that speech about 5 minutes long. What were your takeaways from that?
It was interesting that he chastised the House for this. Effectively, he was saying, I'm going to run a clean and partial trial, but then had an absolute screed against the House and promised to change the Constitution, to amend how we do impeachment, and to call for an audit on public resources on this. That was pretty stunning. In a way, it kind of undercut the kind of idea that he was going to be an impartial voice on this. I thought that he had done a pretty good job. There are definitely qualms about how he made certain decisions and whether or not certain witnesses were allowed to testify. These are all tough calls, and obviously any judge is going to be in a position where they have to make these challenging calls. That does have an effect on the outcome, but now that Dan Patrick has kind of shown his true political intentions here, a lot of people are questioning whether or not he didn't have this in mind from the start.
So now Dan Paxton is reinstated as Attorney General. What comes next here?
Well, I think the first thing up is that it's going to be revenge. And although people say it's best served cold, I think we're going to see a lot of piping hot revenge. The 2 senators who I mentioned who voted most consistently against the Attorney General aren't actually up for re-election until 2026, and so they've got a bit of a break. But for sure, there are several members of the House, especially those in the impeachment team, who are going to get some serious political blowback from this. But Ken Paxton's not totally out of the woods. He still has an ongoing FBI investigation related to bribery. He's got criminal charges against him on securities fraud, which is going to take place here in Harris County in October. And there's a chance he could lose his law license. There's an ongoing complaint against him for his actions on January 6th. And there are new allegations from former members of the Texas bar who say that because of all the things that happened through the impeachment process and some of the allegations there, that he should lose his law license.
We're going to dig into more of those in just a few minutes. But before I let you go, Brandon, was there anything else that you really wanted our viewers to recognize about what happened today?
What's really interesting to me is not so much the way that it went down. This was expected. This is partisans following their own partisan line. That's something we've seen in impeachments across the country, and at least since the mid 2000s when the kind of partisan era took hold. But what's interesting about this is that there were 4 of these articles that Dan Patrick mentioned, the last thing they voted on. That was to hold those articles in abeyance. These were all about the securities fraud case that I mentioned, and they didn't even hear evidence on those. They were going to, by the rules, postpone those until after they had a result of the first 16. And as we saw, he was acquitted on all those charges. So this group of senators voted at the beginning of this process to hear all the evidence. And that was something where they could have kicked out all of these charges, but they didn't. They wanted to proceed, and they did. They acquitted him, but then they proceeded to kick off these charges. So we won't actually have any more impeachment. That was a little bit surprising to me because I thought that they'd want to follow the kind of logic there, hear these individual allegations, see the evidence, and then vote, but they didn't do that.
It kind of sounds like they were ready to be done, as I'm sure you are. Now we'll let you get some rest, but I appreciate all of the time and perspective that you've provided over the past, 10 days since the trial kicked off. Brandon, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Brandi.
All right, so the big question is, how did we get here? Jason Whiteley from WFAA, our sister station in Dallas, catches us up.
Have all members voted? There have been 121 ayes and 23 nays. The resolution is adopted.
To pinpoint the one thing that led Texas Republicans to impeach their own attorney general, you need only go back a few months when Ken Paxton asked state lawmakers to pay $3.3 million so he could settle a lawsuit brought by former employees of his who blew the whistle on him.
I'm just trying to get some clarity. Is the case against the state of Texas, or is it against General Paxton?
Really, the whole thing comes down to having Texas pick up the bill for, firing the whistleblowers.
So Paxton asks for taxpayer money to be spent on his own legal settlement.
If this legislative body does not vote to pay that, then what would be the next steps? What will happen then?
House Republicans refuse and quietly open an investigation into the Attorney General. The result of the legislature's investigation, that is what led to the 20 articles of impeachment. But let's back up here and put the pieces of this puzzle together. It mainly centers around one of Paxton's many political donors, a man named Nate Paul. Prosecutors say Paxton went out of his way to help Paul, did things for him as Attorney General that benefited Paul, not taxpayers. Things such as blocking public information requests to protect Nate Paul's records in the Texas Department of Public Safety, writing an official legal opinion as Attorney General to protect Nate Paul's properties from foreclosure, and appointing a special prosecutor, among other things, to investigate issues for Nate Paul. What in the world do you think Ken Paxton saw in Nate Paul?
Look, he clearly should have had better judgment about Nate Paul. Obviously, he's facing very serious problems right now. There was chatter and I think doubt about his business empire, how quickly he emerged as a major player, really kind of out of nowhere, and the way he was operating, his flashy lifestyle. So I do think he probably showed some poor judgment there and perhaps, trusting Nate Paul's word as much as he did.
When Paxton's top staff, his own deputies that he handpicked, finally blew the whistle on him, Paxton fired that group. They sued, and Paxton agreed to settle the lawsuit. Problem is, he asked the state legislature to pay that settlement, $3.3 million of taxpayer money.
He wants Texas to eat the money. I'm sorry, but unless Ken Paxton reimburses the state of Texas for what his actions cost us, then he's dead to me. I'm sorry. It's that simple.
David Leith is a Republican precinct chair in Collin County, one of the guests on this week's episode of Y'all-itics, and evidence of the sharp division among Texas Republicans. Paxton denies he did anything wrong, and grassroots Republicans still support Paxton. They disregard the impeachment trial. Traditional conservatives, though, say let this rare process play out. A unique political event that finally begins this week in Austin. In Dallas.
And has now concluded. Again, if you're just joining us, Attorney General Ken Paxton, who had been suspended since the House impeached him back in May, has now been reinstated into that role after he was acquitted on all articles of impeachment under consideration by the Texas Senate. I do want to now go back to that day, back to May 27th, when the House voted 121 to 23. 60 of those votes, the yes votes, came from Republicans to impeach Paxton. Janelle Bluda was there at the Capitol that day.
20 articles of impeachment were brought before the House today. Charges against Attorney General Ken Paxton that included bribery, unfitness for office, and abuse of public trust.
And he broke the law. This article represents abuse of official capacity, which is a third-degree felony.
For 4 hours, members went back and forth over the evidence presented. Some weren't convinced.
Which bears all of the hallmarks of the weaponization of government power to target a political opponent.
But in the end, the bipartisan vote leaning heavily in favor of impeaching Paxton.
The chair directs the chief clerk to notify the governor of the House's action.
And the attorney general was immediately removed from office.
What seems to be a longstanding form of corruption has now been voted out, and I think that is a significant step for the integrity of the state and for our Constitution.
Houston's Representative Ann Johnson was on the investigating committee that brought forth the impeachment articles.
And then he came to the Texas House and asked us to write a blank check for taxpayers to make the people that were whistleblowing his crimes go away and hide it from the people of Texas.
Before today, the state has only impeached 2 elected officials, a former governor in 1917 and a former judge in 1975. Houston Representative Sophronia Thompson was in office during the last impeachment. She says while today's hearing was shorter, she says there was enough evidence to vote yes.
From my vantage point and what we have known during the session and what presented to us for the $3.3 million that we still don't know why we were asked to pay for that, I do not think it was rushed.
Now, it's worth noting those previous to impeachment, those folks didn't beat the charges. This is the first time that a statewide official in Texas who was impeached was not then, did not have any of those articles of impeachment sustained against him. Barely a week after the House voted to impeach Paxton, we already knew who some of the legal teams were going to be, and they were really a focal point of the trial because, as you know, we didn't have Paxton there for the majority of it. So a lot of folks were watching the back and forth between the defense and the House managers, the prosecution here. Ahead of the trial, Len Cannon sat down with the guys who were really the figureheads for the prosecution and for the defense. We're going to start with his interview with Dick DeGuerin.
Dick DeGuerin famously defended real estate heir Robert Durst, who was acquitted of murdering a Galveston man after admitting he cut up the body. Now he will try and prove the state's top cop is a crook.
Ken Paxton calls the impeachment an illegal scheme, an act of political retribution.
Well, by whom? Every representative from his home county, Collin County, voted against him.
Paxton, who was overwhelmingly reelected last November, faces 20 articles of impeachment for abuse of office, fraud, and bribery. The most talked about charge is Article number 9. House investigators say Paxton's alleged mistress was hired by Paxton donor Nate Paul in exchange for favorable legal assistance from the AG's office.
You have proof of that?
Of course.
But can you connect the dots that it was in exchange for favors from the AG's office?
The connect the dots happens because in conjunction with and at the same time that that's going on, Paxton does several things that help Nate Paul.
And the alleged mistress?
Will you interview her? Will she be called to testify?
She will be called to testify.
And so will the campaign donor. 2/3 of the state's 31 senators must agree to convict Paxton, one of them being his own wife, Senator Angela Paxton.
Can you overcome in the Senate a jury that is filled with Paxton political allies?
I hope so. I think that they've had enough.
Houston attorney Tony Busby threw the first verbal jab barely a minute into his news conference.
The impeachment articles that have been laid out by the House are baloney.
He quickly followed up with this.
And I'm embarrassed by our House would send something like that out, would vote on something like that and send it to the Senate with a suggestion that there should be some sort of trial.
But there will be a trial sometime this summer in the Texas Senate. In a story Hollywood couldn't have written better. An impeachment of Republican Ken Paxton, the state's top law enforcement officer, in a trial with big-name Houston lawyers on both sides. Rusty Hardin and Dick DeGuerin prosecuting, Tony Busby and Dan Cogdell defending.
The Speaker's followers and himself thought that they could pull off what could only be described as a drive-by shooting on a holiday weekend to politically assassinate one of the leading conservative voices, not only in Texas, but also in the United States.
DeGuerin points out what Busby calls a political assassination was based on a bipartisan impeachment vote in the House that is overwhelmingly Republican. And he told me this today, quote, "I'm glad Paxton has a good lawyer. He's going to need it."
One thing Busby did right out of the gate was push for the articles of impeachment to be thrown out. And in response, House managers dumped about 4,000 pages of evidence into the public realm. We had investigative reporter Cheryl Mercedes dig through those court documents.
According to the impeachment court filings, suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton went to great lengths to hide his relationship with Nate Paul. Blake Brickman, a former deputy attorney general, said his obsession with anything related to Nate Paul was so obvious that it really just shocked me. The attorney general was literally obsessed with anything related to Nate Paul. The filings outline clandestine meetings Paxton had with Paul that the security detail and scheduler not know about. Paul is facing charges for financial crimes. The evidence highlights a web of alleged shell companies he used for disguising, camouflaging, and concealing fraudulent transfers or assets and cash. Another piece of evidence is a whistleblower's text from a former assistant attorney general notifying Paxton that he and other deputy attorneys had reported his relationship with Nate Paul and activities to appropriate law enforcement. They requested a meeting with Paxton to discuss it. Paxton replied that he was out of the office and to email me the issues so they can be fully addressed. Another exhibit from an Uber employee confirmed a trip history taken between January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2020 under the name Dave P. In court documents filed earlier in the week, it said that this Uber account was jointly accessed by Paxton and Paul, and Paxton used this account to go to where his mistress resided.
Those 4,000 pages of documents, not enough, according to Texas senators as they voted to acquit Ken Paxton on all 16 articles of impeachment they considered, dismissing the other 4 without consideration. Throughout the trial, all eyes were on Angela Paxton, Ken Paxton's wife and a sitting senator. Now, she wasn't allowed to vote in the proceedings, but she was required to be there every day and hear all the allegations made against her husband. Before the trial even got going, Teresa Woodard introduced us to this key figure.
Good evening.
Ken Paxton's campaign still has this video posted on its YouTube channel from 7 years ago.
Well, I am Angela Paxton, as my last name might kind of give away. I am married to our Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton.
Before winning election to the Texas Senate, Angela Paxton sometimes campaigned with her husband and sang.
I'm a pistol packing mama, and my husband Sue's Obama. I'm a pistol packing mama, yes I am.
Angela and Ken met at Baylor University. They married in 1986 and had 4 children. Through the years, they've shared several family photos on social media. She was a career educator, a teacher, and then a guidance counselor. 16 years after her husband entered politics, she did too.
Angela Paxton is an educator with 22 years of experience helping kids reach their dreams.
In 2018, Angela Paxton ran for the same state Senate seat Ken Paxton once held. She won, and won again in 2022. As a senator, she's also now a juror in her husband's impeachment trial. But she is a juror without a vote.
The motion is adopted.
The Texas Senate approved 31 rules to govern the upcoming trial, and rule number 31 applies solely to Angela Paxton. It says spouses have a conflict of interest. It allows her to hear all of the evidence, but that's all she can do. When senators deliberate behind closed doors, she will not listen in or weigh in. Her presence counts towards the total number of votes needed to convict her husband, but she will not cast a vote on anything. Senator Paxton voted against those rules. Then she put out a statement saying she will do everything in her power to be a voice for the people of her district. Never before has a Texas Attorney General been impeached. And never before
I'm a pistol packing mama, yes I am.
has a senator sat in on her husband's impeachment trial. In Dallas, I'm Teresa Woodard.
Everything about this trial was historic. It was the first time it had played out in the age of social media, first time in more than 100 years that a statewide officer had been impeached. But the trial is over. Paxton's issues, maybe not. There are some other cases he's up against, so I want to run down those. First up, here in Houston, Paxton's going to have to answer for his security fraud charges. He's accused of deceiving investors of a Dallas-based tech startup. They say Paxton did not disclose that he was being paid by the company to recruit those investors. His next court appearance is scheduled for October 6th, and if convicted, he could get up to 99 years in prison. Marcelino Benito was there when Paxton appeared in court on those charges earlier last month, I should say.
This court appearance lasted just under 10 minutes. As you know, Paxton is facing serious felony charges and could serve up to 99 years in prison if he's ultimately convicted. Now, at today's hearing, Paxton sat in the front row and did not speak, while his defense team and state prosecutors talked this case through with the judge. The embattled AG is facing 2 counts of securities fraud for convincing investors to buy stock in a Dallas area tech startup without disclosing he was being paid for it. He's also charged with 1 count of failing to register with state securities regulators. The indictment dates back to 2015, but has been stalled due to disagreements over venue. Now that that's been settled, the case will move forward here in Harris County. The judge did not set a trial date today, instead ordering both sides to return on October 6th after Paxton's impeachment trial. Here's what both legal teams told us after Paxton's appearance.
This judge sent a message that no one's above the law and everybody's treated the same. And while you may get to duck out with your detail, you still have to come through the front door and you still have to sit your behind in that seat like every other defendant.
The best outcome for us is either a dismissal or we prevail at trial. But again, we got to figure out what happens at the impeachment trial first.
Both sides agree the impeachment trial will have an impact on this case. If Paxton is removed from office, both legal teams say it could lead to a quicker resolution to this criminal case, perhaps even a settlement. Now, as if all that weren't enough, Paxton is also facing a federal investigation, and what happens there could very well also impact what happens here in this criminal case in Harris County. So if indeed he does go to trial here, don't expect that to happen until January or February of 2024.
So let's talk about that federal case. The Justice Department is investigating Paxton for corruption. The DOJ took over the case from state prosecutors back in February, and their findings have yet to be released. Now I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to talk about what happened just last month. The State Bar of Texas filing a complaint asking for Paxton to be investigated. It cited the same allegations as the articles of impeachment, including misconduct and abuse of office. The State Bar has the power to ban Paxton from ever practicing law in Texas again. There was a lot of interest in this trial early on, but for a statewide figure to be impeached, I think a lot of our political analysts would agree that they expected more attention from the public. But a lot of people don't understand what the Attorney General does or the impact that that position has on the average Texan's life. So Adam Bennett broke it down for us.
The Attorney General is the state's top lawyer. The actions of his office reach people in every part of Texas at every level of society. The AG's office enforces open government laws and child support orders. They also investigate Medicaid and consumer fraud. One settlement that impacted a lot of Houstonians involved price gouging during Hurricane Harvey. Paxton's office forced 48 gas stations to refund customers. Last week, he announced an investigation into Texas Children's Hospital over gender-affirming care. University of Houston political science professor Brendan Rottinghouse believes all Texans should be watching what happens with this impeachment vote.
The biggest reason people should care is that it's about accountability. There is the impeachment process built into the separation of powers because if you have one agent in government who's doing something problematic, either criminal or unethical, then the other branches are supposed to check that. This is the core foundation of how the separation of powers works.
The AG also represents the state of Texas in lawsuits against other states or the federal government. Paxton has sued over immigration, healthcare, elections, and environmental issues. The Attorney General is chosen by Texas voters, most recently last year. That election happens every 4 years. Adam Bennett, KHOU 11 News.
For our complete coverage of what led up to the impeachment trial, how it all went down day by day, and what comes next, you can text the word Paxton to 713-526-1111, and we will send you links to all of those stories. Thank you so much for watching KHOU 11 News. I'm going to remind you that you can watch anytime on a Roku TV, Fire TV, and it's not on this graphic, but you can also watch on Apple TV.